Hi, my name is Kwame Waititu, and today I'll be discussing the 5 elements of hip hop. Now, hip hop is the biggest cultural zeitgeist that we have in the modern world. As a genre, it has dominated the charts for at least over 10 years, a decade. From people like Cardi B, Post Malone, Ice Spice, Young Thug, Future, Drake, Kendrick Lamar. These are all people that we know in the modern zeitgeist. They're popular. The genre of hip hop has influenced how people talk, dress, express themselves. The culture itself has been so influential, and as we have seen in the past, in the great rap beef of 2024, as I like to call it, between Drake and Kendrick Lamar, hip hop is a cultural mainstay, and it's here to stay. So today I want to talk about the foundation of hip hop, because the foundation of hip hop is crucial. Now, I grew up listening to Ice Cube and 8Ball and MJG. I wasn't really listening to the rappers at the time, like Future and Young Thug. I was actually a really old head. Hip hop was passed down to me from my neighbors and the griots in the community, and people I've seen on the internet who were talking about hip hop and the time before I was conscious about how hip hop was and what it was like. And so some of my first hip hop experiences were those 90s albums. I could name you all my favorite 90s albums, even beyond that, the golden age. So that's the age that I grew up listening to, at least. And I think it's incredibly important for people to understand the 5 elements, because I feel like nowadays people do not know the 5 elements of hip hop. So I'm here to educate people about it, because the 5 elements of hip hop are incredibly important to how hip hop is understood and created. A lot of people now, especially rappers and stuff, I do like new rappers, but a lot of people do not know the 5 elements and fail to understand hip hop as a cultural element, and it's not respected due to the fact that people don't know its foundation. And so the foundation of hip hop and its guidelines are crucial if you want to consume, create, or passively listen to one song or two in the car about hip hop. So the 5 elements of hip hop I will get into immediately. So the 5 elements of hip hop include DJing, MCing, which is rapping, breakdancing, graffiti, and knowledge. Those are the 5 elements of hip hop. Those are the 5 crucial pillars of what keeps the house of hip hop standing on the bedrock. So you have to know these elements, because the Harlem Gallery of Science, in the article "The 5 Pillars of Hip Hop," it clearly states the 5 elements in their importance to the culture. The article states that these pillars of hip hop ushered it into the 21st century, and it ushered it into the golden age. These foundations in the genre is what held it up for so long. If it wasn't for these crucial parts of the genre, these pillars, DJing, MCing, breakdancing, graffiti, and knowledge, hip hop will not be as unique and as special as it is today. Hip hop has had many changes throughout the years. So we have to understand that in the early 70s, when hip hop was being created in the South Bronx, now there are debates on if hip hop was created in the South Bronx, what part of the Bronx it was created in. It was created in the South Bronx, to me, August 11th, 1973. That is the date that all hip hop heads have in their minds and they cherish. So yes, to me, it was created in the South Bronx. When it was created, hip hop wasn't seen as its own unique genre yet. Hip hop was seen akin to more like funk and disco. It wasn't really its own thing. It was seen as kind of like how EDM is seen today, where EDM is considered its own genre, but it's more seen as a subset of like techno music and hip hop. It's not really seen as an independent thing. It is an independent thing in my opinion, but it's not exactly the same, but that's the kind of way to look at how hip hop was kind of seen in the early 70s. So when these 5 terms were created, and these 5 terms were created by somebody called Afrika Bambaataa. Afrika Bambaataa is considered the grandfather of hip hop. He created the Zulu Nation. He was there when some of the first MCs were creating their records, like Melly Mel, considered the first rapper. Afrika Bambaataa is the godfather of hip hop, and he even coined the term hip hop in 1982. So, when these 5 pillars of hip hop were created, that is when hip hop was officially discovering its own identity, right? it was in the 80s where we started to get Run DMC and LL Cool J, Rakim, Slick Rick, Ice-T. Hip-hop was now developing its own unique sound and its own unique style. Now, you have to understand, while hip-hop was creating its own unique sound and style, hip-hop and now its kind of cousin, R&B, were completely two different genres. So hip-hop was still kind of like in this era of discovery and nuance. But because of these new 5 pillars created by Afrika Bambaataa, like I said, hip-hop was now being ushered into this golden age, which is considered to be the late 90s to the late 80s, excuse me, the late 80s to the mid to late 90s is considered the golden age of hip-hop. And the golden age of hip-hop is important. A lot of the 90s did include most of the elements, and the most important element, knowledge. Knowledge is the most important hip-hop element. It was stated by Afrika Bambaataa himself that knowledge is the most important element of hip-hop. In the Dictionary.com article, The 5 Elements of Hip-Hop, the article states that Afrika Bambaataa, the godfather of hip-hop, like I said, the man who coined the 5 elements, stated that knowledge is the most important element. Knowledge is a core component of hip-hop. Hip-hop is uniquely known, maybe other than punk and rock, but hip-hop is uniquely known for being a voice to the people, specifically African Americans. It's known as a voice for them, and voice for people like me. Hip-hop is incredibly important when it comes to voicing people's frustration with the system, with themselves, their personal truths. Hip-hop inspires revolutionary action, expressing one's social, political, and personal truths, like I said. That's what hip-hop is about, and that's what the knowledge part of hip-hop is about. So you have to understand that hip-hop was created, the most important element was to be this, usherer of knowledge, this usherer of truth, this usherer of the people, this usherer of being yourself and expressing yourself. One of the most important hip-hop songs, in my opinion, Expressing Yourself by NWA. Hip-hop was not, like I said, hip-hop was not considered its own genre until these 5 elements were cemented. Dwayne Oxford elaborates beautifully in his article, The Moment I Knew 90s Era Hip-Hop Was in Trouble, that the 90s era of hip-hop, while sounding different region to region, was built off the back of the 5 elements. And at the time, those were the foundations of the music. So at the time in hip-hop, you have to understand that, hip-hop was built off, different regional sounds. But each regional sound is built off one of the 5 elements. One of the 5 elements was included in the music. And that is important because I feel like today, now, since people don't know the 5 elements of hip-hop, they fail to include at least one of the elements of what makes hip-hop so impactful and what makes hip-hop everlasting. Knowledge is a key component. Truth seeking is a key component. That is what hip-hop is about. Hip-hop needs the elements to thrive. It is important to how the genre is formed, how it will continue, and how it will evolve. The 5 pillars of hip-hop are essential to understanding the genre. And without it, hip-hop wouldn't have been able to build and carve itself out from other genres. It wouldn't be able to usher in the golden age of the 90s, as I mentioned. It wouldn't have been able to move forward into the 20th century to get to those favorite artists that a lot of people mentioned, that I mentioned earlier in the video. The 5 elements of hip-hop are foundational to the culture. And whether you know it or not, the foundation of what many consider impactful music are those 5 elements outside of hip-hop. Hip-hop just named it, And without those 5 elements, music would not be as important to us as the community, as African Americans, as it is now. And it is important for us not to lose those 5 elements because that is our voice, and that is how we express our voice, and that's how we keep hip-hop hip-hop. Thank you. My name is Kwame. Thank you for listening.